I studied science to learn how the world works. Science breaks things down into their component parts. This process, this way of thinking, is called reductionism, describing complex higher-level phenomena in terms of simpler lower-level phenomena. Reductionism has been spectacularly successful in science. Reductionism is obviously necessary in explaining how the world works. The big question, especially in biology, is whether reductionism is also sufficient in explaining how the world works. Because, and this is the point, properties of whole things often bear no apparent relationship to properties of their parts. Examine all the parts. Examine the whole thing. It can seem inconceivable how those parts, when combined with nothing new added, make the whole. Feel the wetness of water. How can that sensation come from the gaseous properties of hydrogen and oxygen? This sudden, surprising appearance of radically new properties is called emergence. I like emergence, but is emergence really that surprising? Key is how reductionism and emergence relate, especially in biology. I call it a dance. How do reductionism and emergence dance? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. Reductionism explains wholes solely in terms of their parts. Emergence explains wholes with new rules beyond their parts. In biological explanations, how do reductionism and emergence work together? How do they dance? Are they partners or competitors? I begin at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, quite deliberately with an esteemed physiologist who stands against reductionism's conventional wisdom. He champions holistic, integrated systems biology, Denis Noble. Denis, the tension between reductionism and emergence occurs across all of the sciences. There was and has been a tendency to think that a real science is the reductionism.
Absolutely.
And the emergence is sort of a soft, fluffy thing that
That's
people elicit when they are unable or not yet understanding the reductionism.
Exactly.
But eventually, it'll all be reductionism.
That's right, exactly so.
And you have been a stalwart antagonist of this view.
Absolutely so, but I didn't start there. Way back in the 1950s, 1960s, I thought I was doing the most reductive form of physiology possible. I found two particular kinds of proteins in heart cells that generate the rhythm, and I thought if I could put a computer model together of the processes that those molecules show, I would be able to reproduce heart rhythm. I would have the most reductive explanation of the rhythm of the heart. And it stopped me in the tracks when I came to do the integrations. I had equations for those proteins. I put them together into a computer model. And then I had to put the membrane voltage into the computer model. What was I doing that for? The membrane voltage is a property of the whole cell. Now, the difference between a molecule, I could represent it at the size of my fist, and the edge of a cell, the edge of the cell would be somewhere up in York. That's about 200 miles from here. That voltage over the whole cell controls what happens inside the cell beautifully. In 1960, I could show that generates heart rhythm. But at a stroke, I had to stop being a reductionist because that model was a model between the cell property as a whole, which is its electrical property, and the processes of the proteins and ions down at the lower level. And you have to have the two talking to each other.
Let's get a little philosophical and ask the quality of the system is, of course, built up by the totality of its parts, as you put it.
Yes.
There's no ghost and there's no at any of these levels. So
no need for one, no.
So conceptually, could you then explain the overarching, the system, by something about the parts that we are yet don't know?
You could in principle. You would probably need more material than there is in the universe to build the computers to do it. Yeah. So, yes, in what I could call the Laplace sense. Laplace was a great mathematician who said, if I knew all the movements down to the lowest level, I would be like God. I would know everything. Well, we will never do that, and it's impossible. So, as
impossible in practice.
It's impossible in practice.
But in principle, it is possible.
Now we come to the deeper philosophical point, because what would that in principle require you to know? Yes, exactly. It would require you to know that there are also boundaries that constrain what happens in this great big cell, the cell membrane itself. All of those intracellular organelles, they are all constraining. Now, you'd have to represent that in a molecule by molecule form. You can do it, yes, but you just will never have the computing power to solve the equation. Well, I have had discussions with people who have told me this is nonsense, Denis, but I silence them almost immediately by saying, but look, how would you integrate the equations for any process describing what I'm talking about? You have to bring in the boundary and initial conditions. There's no alternative. It is a mathematical necessity that that be so. It's not an empirical discovery that we've made. It is the understanding, and it is that without the upper level of constraint, you cannot understand how the particles of the system will behave. It's as simple as that. So it's not that there's a choice between the two. There is no alternative. And here I stand. Usually shuts people up.
To Denis, reductionism by itself is not sufficient to explain almost any biological property. One must go beyond local basic mechanisms and involve whole organisms. But isn't the mainstream view in biology, as in physics, reductionism? I'm looking for a hardcore reductionist, and I know just where to find him. In the same place, the Oxford Museum of Natural History. I meet the distinguished evolutionary biologist and naturalist, the author of the epoch-defining book, The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins.
I think emergence is immensely important. I think reduction is immensely important. I think they go together. You have to ultimately believe that everything can be explained in terms of reducing it to its smallest components and how they interact. But it's not feasible to do that in practice, usually. We know that computers, at bottom, nothing but zeros and ones shuttling back and forth in enormous numbers at great speed. But we never actually think about how computers do that. We think in terms of higher level units. We think in terms of, if we're programs, we think in terms of subroutines and procedures. And emergence is vital to that. It's nothing unrespectable about it. It's entirely sensible to talk about emergence.
But it's totally explainable.
Absolutely explainable, yes, it is, yes. I think you can use emergence as well when you think about what the human brain can do, which on the first sight is a bit surprising, given that the human brain is the onboard computer, which was designed by natural selection to survive in the Pleistocene of Africa. But that very same brain turns out emergently to be capable of doing general relativity, quantum theory, composing the Ninth Symphony. This is emergence with a vengeance, and it's very, very impressive. In a way, it's more than we had any right to expect.
But it's an explanatory mechanism. It's not the case that at different levels of organization there are special laws there that are non-reducible.
No.
Some people would say that there are laws or regularities operating at different levels of organization that are somehow built into the nature of reality.
As long as you don't think there's something supernatural about it.
And many of these people would not supernaturalize it, but they would, shall we say, extend the naturalism beyond that which is acknowledged today. That solidify at certain levels principles that are not reducible to the lower level.
Yes, I'm not au fait with that kind of thing.
Richard is a strict reductionist. in that all properties of higher levels can be explained ultimately by properties of lower levels. But because in practice this is not now possible, emergence is also immensely important. But emergence's importance in no way implies that there is anything hiding in emergence that cannot be explained ultimately by lower level mechanisms. This reductionist view of emergence is crucial. That's why I speak with a philosopher who champions reductionism, Alex Rosenberg.
It seems to me that when we look at the history of the last 50 years in biology, we see that the direction of development is in such a way as to make appeals to emergentism more and more superfluous, and to fully and completely understand higher level mechanisms in terms of their component parts operating at lower levels.
Okay. Everything will be explained at the lowest possible level. Okay, so that's clear. On the emergent side, so it's less clear, because you can have weak emergence and strong emergence. Strong emergence is where, in principle, you can never, ever determine the regularity at one level by a lower level, whereas a weak emergence says it seems impossible now, but it is conceivable that science will eventually be able to show it. And your claim is that strong emergence does not exist.
Correct.
But weak emergence...
Well, right. Now I'm inclined to draw a different distinction and use that distinction to help us understand the strong emergence, weak emergence distinction. The distinctions between epistemology and metaphysics.
Okay.
So
okay.
epistemically, it's obvious that science proceeds at many different levels of description, and science is opportunistic in the discovery of regularities at many different levels and at the explanation of the operation of these regularities at many different levels. And it's going to often be the case that we discover things at higher levels that we can't successfully and adequately explain given the available resources that we have at the time that we've discovered the higher level regularities. And those regularities are going to be epistemically emergent. That is to say, we're not going to know how it is that they are brought about by the constitution of the lower level systems out of which objects are composed that these regularities describe. Strong emergence is what I want to deny. Right. And I'm inclined to say that if you sort of get us all in the room, the people who disagree about this, we're all going to end up saying it's only weak emergence that we're committed to. We're not committed to strong emergence because that's serious mystery mongering. In my opinion, the real...
Alex is a full-throated reductionist and proud of it. I admire that. He minimalizes emergence, and he distinguishes weak from strong emergence, both consistent with his robust reductionism. He calls weak emergence an incapacity of the moment, and he denies even the existence of strong emergence. I applaud the clarity, and I agree that weak emergence means only that the reductionist project is not complete. But I do not reject strong emergence. Personally, I love the tension between weak and strong emergence. Still, I wonder whether there may be other ways to consider emergence. I meet a pioneer of philosophy of biology, the author of What's the Use of Philosophy, Philip Kitcher.
So you start off with a few principles, a grand theory of everything. And out of that, you generate, sheerly by deducing all of the other principles of all of the other sciences. So it may be convenient to have chemists and biologists and neuroscientists and psychologists and economists and sociologists, but strictly speaking, it's really all physics. Now, this view actually will not stand up, I think, because you just have to look at the junctions between supposedly adjacent sciences. And one on which I focused early in my career was the theory of inheritance, genetics, and the molecular biology of the gene. So when I looked at that, I realized that it's actually very, very hard to take the language used by geneticists and map it on to the language used by molecular biologists. So what exactly is a gene? Well, if you leave out retroviruses, it's a chunk of DNA. But how big a chunk? Where does a gene start? Where does it end? And there's no good answer to that. So what I came to see was how many concepts that are used in molecular biology are actually functional concepts. Genes are marked out in part by what they do, not just by any underlying structure. And it's this difference between function that's realized in many different ways by many different structures and structure that makes all of these transitions turn out to be difficult.
Is this a question of epistemology or ontology? And maybe we can't even imagine how you can ultimately define things in terms of physics. But is it in principle impossible?
Let me use a very, very simple example. Suppose we want to understand economic transactions, where we refer to, dollars and currency, of currency flows. Can we give a purely physical account of what's going on there? Is it sort of these fundamental particles are moving around in this particular way? I think not. I mean, anything can count as currency as long as it's accepted by people involved in transactions.
Which is a functionalist kind
of. It's a functionalist. So this shows, that there's something vaguely absurd, I think, about the physicist's dream that there would ever be the genesis from physics of something that would give us, say, biology, economics, psychology.
Philip argues that because at different levels of biological organization there are different kinds of meanings, it is not possible for strictly reductive explanations to hold always, and therefore emergence must be taken seriously. I'm all for emergence, but can it survive the relentless onslaught of reductionist science? I ask a philosopher of biology who focuses on the science of purpose, agency, and directionality in biology, Alan Love.
As a philosopher, what I try and do is move away from what's sometimes called an ontological notion of reduction. We are nothing but molecules in motion, to say, how does a scientist represent, investigate, explain how some higher level behavior is connected to the behavior.
So it's like a meta-reductionism, looking at the process of thinking about reductionism.
Right. We might call it reductionism in practice rather than reductionism in principle. You want to say, okay, maybe one does think everything is just molecules in motion, but how do you show it? So within philosophy of science, we make a number of kind of standard distinctions, such as the difference between methodological reduction and epistemological reduction or explanatory reduction. Because I might want to investigate a system at the lowest possible level, but that doesn't mean I necessarily think I can explain it at that lowest possible level. And I can have ways in which I might want to explain it at that lowest possible level, but might be investigating it at another level.
How does reductionism articulate with emergence?
So reductionism has traditionally been thought of as the opposite of emergence. Right. However, once you bring in these distinctions about different kinds of reductionism, and in fact, you can do the same thing for emergence and talk about different kinds of emergence, you end up with all kinds of interesting complex patterns where systems can be simultaneously reducible and emergent at the same time.
Alan distinguishes three kinds of reductionism: methodological, how to study; epistemological, how to explain; ontological, what is really going on. Me, I obsess over the last. What is reality? Does reductionism rule? And is emergence only a symptom of early science? I hope not, and actually, I think not. Are there other more radical ways of watching the reductionism emergence dance? I ask a philosopher who advocates a pluralistic metaphysics of science, John Dupré.
So pluralistic metaphysics I tend to think of in two dimensions. So one dimension is in terms of classification, in terms of kinds, that there are many ways of dividing the biological world into different kinds. The other dimension is what I would call vertical pluralism, which is to say that
if you look at it as a sequence of structural levels, from atoms, molecules, cells, multicellular organisms, societies, whatever, all of these are potentially equally real. The traditional view that this disagrees with is that ultimately the only thing is as real as the smallest constituents of reality, so fundamental physical particles. If that's true, it seems that, where all the particles are is entirely determined by the universal laws that govern their behavior. So, I may move from here to the other side of the table, but each particle that I'm made up for moves on the basis of physical laws, so my moving is an inevitable consequence of all the particles I'm made up from moving. My view is the argument is very weak and quite unsupported by the subsequent history of science, and that we should look at all these different objects at different levels of having their own distinctive causal powers. And so the notion that we have a complete story of the world at the level of atoms is unsupported and unsupportable.
And each of these levels in the vertical hierarchy of your pluralism are real. Are they real at the same fundamental level?
I think the answer is yes. I think there's only one reality and they're all in it. The world is a world of process.
Yeah.
In a world of process, there is a kind of emergent hierarchy over time. So complex structures emerge, but the complex structures, I think, are all processes.
If new entities emerge in this process and they have causal powers, it's not just the illusion of causal powers because what's really happening is at the lowest levels. That's emergence.
That's absolutely. This is why I think that emergence ceases to be puzzling in a process world. The puzzlement that people feel, for example, when they talk about downward causation. Yeah. So big things causing little things, even causing the behavior of their parts. But if you think as the billiard ball world that to understand the causal properties of the big things, you just add up the causal properties of the little things somehow or other, then it's mysterious, because then how can the big thing move back and affect the properties of its parts?
A strong emergence is where it's not possible in principle to be able to explain those causal laws at the higher level by anything at the lower level. Is that right?
Well,
in principle, not being able to ever be able to describe the top-down causation.
No, top-down causation is certainly, ontologically, it's really excluded by any kind of reductionism. So, yes, I think that weak emergentism really is reductionism.
Agree.
Without the nerve,
Stigma.
without the strength of mind to really accept it. I think methodologically, scientists tend to be reductionists. It means that they solve the problems that can be solved reductionistically, but don't ask certain other questions. But I think a lot of philosophers are still ontological reductionists,
Yes.
probably even the majority. It's a mystery to me at this point how that could still be the case.
Although I call it a dance, the interplay between reductionism and emergence is truly fundamental. Reductionism, which means higher levels are explained by lower levels, is certainly true. The deep question about reductionism is whether it is the only truth. The deep question about emergence is whether it's only weak emergence, just methods and descriptions while waiting for science to advance, or also strong emergence, where higher levels cannot be explained, not ever explained by lower levels. Smart opinions differ wildly. Reductionism alone cannot explain almost any biological property. Emergence is entirely sensible in terms of describing higher-level units, but ultimately all will be explainable by lower-level units. Weak emergence is early science, which will yield to strong reductionism. Different levels of biology have different kinds of meaning. Distinguish three kinds of reductionism: methodological, epistemological, ontological. Reductionism is undermined by metaphysical pluralism plus the primacy of process. As for me, I can argue that strong reductionism is default science, and that weak emergence is strong reductionism with a fancy name. But here's my key question. To find the foundations of the world, do we need strong emergence to dance closer to truth?
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.